Eleanor McBride drove the knife into the wagon board and used it to pull herself upright. Her shoulder was dislocated. She knew it the way a woman knows a thing she can't afford to feel yet, as a fact, not a sensation. The wagon was on its side. The horse was gone. Her children were somewhere in the dark behind her, and men with lanterns were moving along the ridge above, close enough that she could hear them calling to each other through the blizzard. She pulled the knife free, turned around, and put her body between her children and the light. If this story moves you, please subscribe and follow it all the way to the end. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Cole Hargrove had one rule about the East Ridge Road in December. He didn't use it. It was a dead end, ran straight into the Pemberton Mining Access Trail, and stopped there like a sentence that forgot how to finish. Nobody had business on that road in a blizzard unless they owned the mine or were running from someone who did. Cole was neither. He was cutting north toward Holt's fence line to check a section he'd heard had come down in the last storm, and the East Ridge was the short way. He took it because Deputy wouldn't stop pulling left. The dog was 13 years old and moved like a man who'd been shot twice and remembered both times. But when he pulled with intention. Cole had learned years ago that arguing with Deputy was a waste of good thinking. He smelled the wagon before he saw it. Pine pitch and wet canvas, and the specific sharp smell of fresh wood cracked under force. Then his horse stopped hard, ears flat, and Cole looked down the slope and saw them. A woman on her knees in the snow, both arms locked around two children, her body curved forward over them. Her dark coat spread wide like wings that had already decided they were the last shelter available. Her head was up. She was looking at the ridge above her, not at the ground, not at her children, at the ridge, watching the lanterns move. Cole sat on his horse for 3 full seconds. He'd been good at this job once, reading situations fast, cataloging threat and exit and probability before most men finished drawing breath. 2 years of horses and silence had slowed him down some, but not that much. 3 lanterns, moving in a sweep pattern, not a search. A sweep meant they knew approximately where she was and were tightening the circle. The woman knew it too. She wasn't calling out, wasn't moving. She was doing the math the same way he was doing it, and she'd come to the same answer. Stay still, stay low, and pray the snow covered the wagon before the lanterns found it. He could ride north, check Holt's fence, come back a different way. Nobody on that ridge had seen him yet. Deputy made a sound low in his throat that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a whimper. It was the sound he made when he'd already decided and was waiting for Cole to catch up. The little girl turned her face out from her brother's shoulder and looked directly at Cole through the dark and the falling snow. She didn't cry. She didn't reach out. She just looked at him with the steady eyes of a child who has been told something bad is happening and has decided to watch it clearly rather than look away. Cole dismounted. "Ma'am," he kept his voice below the wind. "Don't move. Don't call out. I'm coming down slow." The woman's head turned. He couldn't see her face yet, just the set of her shoulders. Rigid, calculated. The posture of someone managing pain they decided to deal with later. "How many?" she said. Not a question, a transfer of information. 3 on the ridge. Could be more I haven't seen. "There are 2 more south. They split at the tree line." She shifted her weight, and he heard what it cost her. A single controlled breath, sharp at the edges. "They're trying to cut off the creek road." Cole looked south. She was right. He could see it now. A 4th lantern, barely visible through the trees, moving parallel to the drainage. She'd mapped their pattern in the dark, in a blizzard, with a dislocated shoulder and 2 children under her arms. He filed that away and focused on what mattered right now. My ranch is 1.5 miles west. There's a way through the draw that the ridgemen can't see from above. He crouched down to her level. But we have to move in the next 4 minutes, or they clear the switchback and we lose the angle. She looked at him. Up close, her face was pale and sharp-featured, with a cut above her left eye that had bled and frozen. Her eyes were brown and clear, and doing exactly what his were doing. Reading him, fast, looking for the thing that didn't fit. "You live here," she said. "Alone?" "Yes, ma'am." "Why are you stopping?" It was the right question. He'd asked himself the same one 3 seconds ago on that horse. "Because if I don't," he said, "and I find out tomorrow what happened to you on this road, I won't sleep right for the rest of my life. And I don't sleep well enough already." He looked at her shoulder, the way her left arm hung slightly wrong, the way she hadn't used it since he'd arrived. "That shoulder needs seving, not out here." She held his eyes 1 moment longer. Then she looked at her son. "James," she said quietly, "take your sister's hand." The boy, 8, maybe 9, with his mother's same dark eyes and his mother's same habit of reading a room before he trusted it, looked at Cole once, measuring, and then took his sister's hand without a word. They moved through the draw in silence, Cole leading his horse and keeping his body between the family and the ridge. The woman, he didn't know her name yet, walked without being helped. He offered his arm twice. She declined twice. The third time, when the ground dropped steep and icy, and her boot broke through a crust of snow and she lurched sideways, she grabbed his sleeve without being asked, and let go the moment she had her footing back. She let go fast, like she'd practiced not holding on to things. The little girl, 5, maybe 6, with snow in her hair and the serene expression of someone who had appointed herself observer of the situation, looked up at Cole's horse and said, "What's her name?" "Pepper." "That's a good name," she said seriously. "Deputy's a good name too." She nodded toward the hound limping ahead of them through the snow. "How'd you know his name?" "He looks like a deputy," she said, as if this were obvious, and went back to watching the blizzard. Cole's ranch was dark and cold when they reached it, but the walls held and the stove caught fast, and within 20 minutes the room had come back to life the way rooms do when people who need warmth are suddenly inside them. He got the fire going. He put water on. He went to the cedar chest his mother had sent 2 years ago and opened it for the first time, pulling out blankets that still smelled like her house in Illinois. He'd never had anyone to give them to before. The little girl, Clara, her brother called her, was asleep before the first blanket settled over her, her cheek against a folded feed sack, one hand still loosely gripping her brother's sleeve. James sat beside her with his back straight and his eyes on Cole. Not hostile, not afraid. Watchful. The way a boy watches when he's been the man of the house for longer than he should have been. The woman sat at the table. She had a leather bag in her lap that she had not set down once. Not in the draw, not on the walk, not when she'd stumbled. She'd caught herself with one arm rather than release it. Cole noticed, the same way he'd noticed the shoulder, the same way he'd noticed the sweep pattern on the ridge. He put a tin cup of hot water in front of her. "I'm out of coffee," he said. "I know." "I've had worse." She wrapped both hands around the cup and closed her eyes. 3 seconds. Exactly 3. Then she opened them, and she was back, fully present, fully reading the room. "Your shoulder needs to go back in," he said. "I know." "It's going to hurt." "I know that too." "You want me to warn you before I do it, or just do it?" She looked at him. Something moved through her expression. Not gratitude, not relief. just the faint recalibration of someone who hadn't been asked what they wanted in a long time. "Just do it," she said. He positioned her arm, found the angle, and reset it in one clean motion. She made one sound, short, bitten off hard, swallowed immediately. And then she was still. James didn't look away from his sister. He'd heard it, and he'd chosen to look at Clara instead, which told Cole everything about how many times this boy had absorbed something bad and redirected his attention deliberately. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was level. "What's your name, ma'am?" "Eleanor McBride." She flexed the fingers of her reset arm carefully, testing. "My husband was Thomas McBride. He worked accounts for Pemberton Mining out of Billings." She paused. The fire popped. "He's dead." Cole sat down across from her. "When?" "8 months ago. Number 3 shaft." Her voice was flat, the way ice is flat. Smooth on the surface, pressure underneath. "They filed it as an accident. They're very good at filing accidents." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where are you headed?" "There's a federal land office in Billings, and a judge, Alderman Price, who I was told by a man my husband trusted is not owned by Pemberton." She looked down at the bag. "I have Thomas's notebook. He kept records, names, dates, payments, everything Pemberton's been doing for 4 years. She looked back up, including the Colville collapse. The name hit him the same way it always hit him, like a door opening in a room he'd walled off. "What do you know about Colville?" he asked. "I know 7 men died, and the investigation found no negligence." She reached into the bag and set a folded newspaper clipping on the table between them. "I know a Pinkerton detective named Cole Hargrove wrote an original report that named Pemberton directly. I know that report was buried, and Hargrove resigned rather than sign the replacement." She didn't look at the clipping. She looked at him. "My husband believed your report was the truth. He kept a copy of it. He kept your name." Cole didn't touch the newspaper. "How long have you known who I was?" he asked. "Since you said your name on the ridge?" A beat. "I recognized it immediately. Thomas made me memorize the people connected to this, in case something happened to him." She was quiet for a half-second. "He was thorough. He had to be. Men like Pemberton don't leave threads." "No, they don't." She put her hand flat on the table. Her knuckles were scraped raw, from the wagon, from the snow, from whatever she'd grabbed when everything went sideways. "They left Thomas in a shaft and called it careless. They've been sending men after me for 4 days because I left with that notebook instead of grieving quietly." Her jaw tightened. "I am not grieving quietly." Cole looked at her, at the ink on her right hand, faint but visible, the kind that comes from writing for long hours over many days, at the way she'd positioned herself at the table with a clear line to the door and a view of the window, at the leather bag that she touched without thinking, the way people touch things they've promised to protect. "There's a federal marshal named Garrett," he said, "rides the Northern Territory. He's not owned by anyone because he's too stubborn and too mean to be bought." He paused. "I know how to reach him." Eleanor stared at him. "Why would you do that?" she said. And there it was, the same question she'd asked on the ridge, said the same way. Not suspicious, not grateful, genuinely asking. The question of a woman who had learned not to assume. Cole looked at the newspaper clipping, at his own name in faded print. He thought about the night his supervisor had handed him back the falsified report and told him to sign it, and the way he'd felt, not angry, not righteous, just tired. Tired of being part of a machine that ground people down and called the powdered dust. He'd walked out. He'd told himself that was enough. He'd been lying to himself for 2 years. Your husband kept 7 names in his notebook, Cole said. The men from Colville. I wrote those names in my original report, and someone removed them. They weren't in any record, any filing, any newspaper. He met her eyes. How did Thomas get them? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. He went to the families, she said softly. He spent 3 months finding the families of every man who died. He wrote down what they told him. A pause. He said someone should have done it already. Cole was quiet for a long time. Outside, the blizzard had found its full voice, pressing against the cabin walls with the steady insistence of something that intended to stay. The fire held. Deputy had relocated from the corner to the foot of Clara's makeshift bed and was lying there with the dignified certainty of a dog who had decided his assignment for the evening. You need to sleep, Cole said finally. I need to get to Billings. The pass has been closed since Sunday. You're not moving for 3 days minimum, maybe 5. He stood. You need sleep. Your children need sleep. And in the morning, you need to eat something. And let me look at that shoulder properly. And tell me everything that's in that notebook, so that when we do move, we move smart. She searched his face the way she'd searched the ridge, looking for the pattern, the sweep, the thing that gave away the real intention underneath. She didn't find one. There's a bolt on the top of the door, he said. Latch at the bottom. You slide both, and nobody gets in without waking you first. She looked at the door, then at him. You're sleeping in the barn. Me and Deputy and 4 horses who won't mind the company. Something shifted in her expression. Small, quick, almost imperceptible. The specific expression of a woman who has been handled and managed and maneuvered for months, and has just been handed instead something as simple and unfamiliar as a choice. Cole, she said. It was the first time she'd used his name. He didn't remark on it. If Pemberton's men find this ranch, they won't tonight. Storm's too heavy. They'll wait it out and regroup in the morning. He picked up his rifle. Which means tonight you're safe. Sleep while you are. He pulled on his coat and moved to the door. Behind him, James McBride said quietly and without drama, "Mister." Cole stopped. The boy was still sitting beside his sleeping sister. He hadn't moved in an hour. His back was still straight. His eyes were still the same dark, careful, older than they should be eyes. "You're going to stand watch," James said. "Aren't you?" "Yes, son." James nodded slowly. He looked at his mother, then back at Cole. "My father used to stand watch," he said, "when he found something worth protecting." Cole didn't answer. He opened the door, and the blizzard came in cold and immediate, filling the room for 1 sharp second, and then he was through it, and the door closed behind him, and the bolt slid home. He heard it, both locks, top and bottom, exactly as he'd told her. He stood on the porch in the white dark and breathed. Somewhere behind him, through the walls of that cabin, Eleanor McBride was sitting at the table with her dead husband's notebook pressed against her chest, 8 months pregnant, 4 days running, 2 children sleeping at her back. She was alive because a 13-year-old dog had pulled left on a leash. Cole looked out at the wall of snow and thought about 7 names that had been removed from a document. He thought about Thomas McBride, who had spent 3 months finding the families who held those names. He thought about how a man can walk away from one thing and spend 2 years telling himself it was enough. He gripped the rifle and took up his position at the corner of the porch, where the overhang gave him a sightline both directions, and he stood watch. The way a man stands watch over something worth protecting, in the oldest kind of December, with the snow coming down like the world was trying to cover everything that had ever happened, and starting fresh. It didn't work that way. Cole knew that better than most. Underneath all that clean white silence, The evidence of every buried thing was still exactly where it had been left. And in the morning, a woman who refused to grieve quietly was going to help him dig it back up. He lasted until 2 in the morning before the cold drove him inside. Not the temperature. Cole had stood watch in worse. It was the specific kind of cold that comes with a blizzard that intends to stay. The kind that gets into the joints and makes a man's hands slow. And slow hands on a rifle are worse than no hands at all. He stamped his boots at the door and came in quiet, expecting the cabin to be dark and silent. Eleanor was sitting at the table, with a lantern turned low, the notebook open in front of her, a pencil moving. She didn't look up when he entered. "I told you to sleep," he said. "I'm copying it," she said, "in case they get the original. 2 copies are harder to make disappear than 1. Cole stood in the doorway and looked at her. The pencil didn't stop. Her handwriting was small and precise, the kind of handwriting that had been trained into her. A schoolteacher's hand. Economical, clear, built for being read by others. She was writing names. He could see that much from across the room. A column of names, each one with a number beside it. He took off his coat and sat down at the other end of the table. She kept writing. "Thomas taught you that," he said. "Make copies." "Thomas taught me a lot of things." A pause in the pencil. Just 1 beat. Then it started again. "He said the most dangerous document is the only document. He said powerful men don't destroy evidence. They destroy the people who hold it, because that's cleaner." She turned a page. "So I'm making sure there's more than one person holding it." Cole watched her write for a while. The fire had settled to coals, and the cabin had gone quiet in the way it goes quiet at 2 in the morning. The children breathing. Deputy's slow exhale. The blizzard talking to itself against the walls. "How long have you been a teacher?" he asked. She did look up then. Brief, assessing. "Since I was 19. St. Louis District, then a private school on Chambers Street." She went back to writing. "How long have you been asking questions you already know the answer to?" "Occupational habit." "You're not a detective anymore." "No, ma'am." "Then you can just ask what you want to know." Cole leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked. James shifted in his sleep and put one arm across his sister without waking. The unconscious protection of a boy who'd been doing it long enough that his body had memorized the motion. "The men on the ridge," Cole said. "You recognize the pattern. Sweep formation. That's not something a person figures out in the dark by accident." He kept his voice even. "How long have they been following you?" Eleanor's pencil stopped. She didn't look up right away. When she did, her expression had shifted. Not closed, not defensive. The expression of someone deciding how much of the full truth to give, and in what order. "Since St. Louis," she said. "Since the week after Thomas died, when I went to his office to collect his things, and found the notebook hidden inside the back cover of a ledger he'd left for me to find." She folded her hands over the notebook. They'd already been through the apartment. They were good. Nothing was obviously disturbed. "But Thomas told me once, if anyone ever searches this place, check the sugar tin, the lining of my winter coat, and the space behind the 3rd baseboard on the left in the study." She paused. "I found 3 separate copies of different sections. He'd been hiding pieces for months." Cole was quiet for a moment. He knew. He knew they'd come. He just didn't know when. Her voice dropped half a register. Not soft, just lower. The way a voice goes when what it's carrying gets heavier. "He left me a letter too. Inside the coat lining, folded around the papers. 2 pages. She looked at her hands. "He told me where to go, and who to trust, and how to travel without being tracked." He told me to take the children and not stop. A beat. He wrote it like he had time. Like he sat down at his desk on a quiet evening and just wrote it calmly. Her jaw tightened. He knew he was going to die, and he used his last private hours to write me instructions. The fire popped once and went back to its low breathing. He loved you, Cole said. He was practical, she said. But something in the way she said it told him she knew the difference between practical and love. And she knew Thomas McBride had been both at the same time. Cole got up and put 2 pieces of wood on the fire. Not because the room needed it yet, because it would in an hour, and because he needed something to do with his hands while he thought. When he sat back down, Eleanor had gone back to writing. The names in the left column, he said. Those are buyers? Inspectors. Men Pemberton paid to sign off on the Colville shaft as structurally sound 6 weeks before it collapsed. She didn't look up. The right column is amounts. The bottom of the page is the date of payment and the date of the inspection report. She turned the page toward him briefly. Thomas cross-referenced everything. He was meticulous. Cole looked at the page. The numbers were specific, not rounded, not approximated. The kind of numbers that come from actual documents, actual ledgers, actual transfer records. His hands went very still on the table. That third name, he said. Harlan Driscoll, County Sheriff, Copper Falls District. She watched his face. You know him. He's the sheriff of this county. Cole sat back. He came through 2 months ago about a fence dispute with my eastern neighbor. I spoke to him for 20 minutes. He looked at the number beside Driscoll's name. $400. Paid in 2 installments, September and November, 1876. She pulled the page back. 8 months before the collapse. Pemberton was buying the inspection before he'd even cut the corners on the shaft supports. Cole stared at the table. The shape of it was becoming clear now. Not just a company cutting safety costs, but a deliberate, pre-planned infrastructure of corruption. Inspectors purchased in advance. A sheriff in his pocket. Reports pre-written before the ink was dry on the work orders. And when Thomas McBride had found the edges of it and started pulling, they'd put him in the ground and filed it clean. The same way they'd filed Colville clean. Your shoulder, he said abruptly. She blinked at the change. What about it? Is there any chance the fall from the wagon? He stopped. He didn't want to ask it. He asked it anyway, because not asking it didn't make it less true. Are you sure the baby's all right? Eleanor was very still for a moment. The pencil lay flat on the table. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her yet. Something unguarded. The briefest glimpse of the thing behind the precision. The woman underneath the map reader and the notekeeper. And the woman who didn't need help standing. I don't know, she said. It cost her something to say it. He could see the cost in the set of her mouth. You felt movement since the fall? Yes. Not as much as usual, but yes. Then most likely fine. He kept his voice matter-of-fact, because that was what she needed. Not reassurance built from air. Assessment built from what was actually known. The cold slows everything down, movement included. He looked at her. But if that changes, I'll tell you. She picked the pencil back up. I'm not stubborn about things that matter. You're plenty stubborn. About the right things. The faintest edge of something in her voice. Not quite humor. The bone structure of humor. Thomas used to say I had the stubbornness of a woman who'd been told no so many times she'd stopped hearing the word. Cole almost smiled. He didn't let himself. He sounds like he was a smart man. Smarter than me in most ways. She turned another page. Smarter than me about people. He could tell in the first 5 minutes of meeting someone whether they were worth the time. She didn't look up, But something in the quality of the silence shifted. "He would have trusted you." Cole said nothing for a moment. "How do you know?" "Because he kept your name." She did look up then, direct and steady. Thomas McBride did not keep the names of men he didn't believe in. He had very limited space in his files, and very precise ideas about what deserved to be in them. She held his eyes. "Your name was on the second page of the first section, right after the 7 men from Colville." A pause. "He put you with the victims, not the witnesses." The fire breathed. Deputy shifted. Outside, the blizzard was discussing itself in a lower register now. Still present, still insistent, but moving from the violent phase into the long endurance phase. The kind of storm that doesn't try to destroy you quickly, but simply remains until you give up fighting it. Cole didn't give up fighting things. It was the one consistent fact about him. "I need to tell you something," he said. "About Colville." "You don't owe me, I need to tell you." He waited until she set the pencil down. "When I wrote the original report, I had documentation, photographs of the shaft supports, testimony from 3 surviving miners who told me specifically what they'd been ordered to cut and when. I had a copy of the inspection report signed by 2 of the men in that column." He nodded at the notebook. "I had enough to close Pemberton down, permanently." Eleanor was very still. "My supervisor at the agency told me the case was being handled at a higher level, that I needed to file my findings through the proper channel and trust the process." His jaw tightened. "I trusted the process. I handed everything over and was told to wait." He looked at the table. 3 weeks later, my supervisor handed me a new report. Clean. No findings of negligence. All my documentation listed as inconclusive. He paused. And a note at the bottom saying my continued employment depended on my signature. "And you walked out." "I walked out." He said it flat. "I told myself it was the right thing, that I hadn't signed the lie, that I hadn't been part of the cover-up, that my conscience was clean." He looked up at her. "But I took my files when I left, and I locked them in a chest, and I came to Montana, and I raised horses, and I told myself that walking out was enough." The words came out level and honest, and with the specific weight of a thing that has been held down for 2 years and is finally being said in the right room to the right person. "It wasn't enough. 7 men stayed dead. Pemberton kept operating. And I went and found myself a quiet corner of the world and stayed in it." Eleanor looked at him for a long time. "Where are the files?" she said. He looked at her. "The documentation, the photographs, the testimony, the copy of the inspection report." She leaned forward slightly. "Where are they?" "Cedar chest, under my bed." The expression that moved across Eleanor McBride's face was not triumph, and it was not relief. It was the expression of a woman who has been carrying an impossible weight for 8 months, and has just found out there is a second set of hands. "Cole," she said, "your files and Thomas's notebook together—" "Is enough to hang him," Cole said. "Yes, I know." They looked at each other across the table. The lantern burned between them, steady and low. Outside, the blizzard insisted on itself. Inside, something had shifted. Not between them exactly, but in the room, in the shape of what they were both carrying. It was still heavy. It was still dangerous. But it had been redistributed, and that changes what a person can do with it. James McBride said, from the darkness near the wall where his sister slept. "How long have you been awake?" Cole asked. "A while." The boy sat up. His voice was careful. Not a child's careful, a deliberate careful. the careful of someone who has learned to measure what he says before he says it.
I heard what you said about Colville.
Eleanor said his name quietly, a warning note in it. He should know, James said to his mother, not defiant, certain. He's helping us, and he should know what he's helping with. Cole looked at the boy, 8 years old, and already understanding that fair exchange requires full information. Thomas McBride's son. What do you want to know? Cole asked him. James thought about it for a moment, the way he thought about everything, thoroughly, without rushing. The men following us, he said. The ones on the ridge. Are they going to come here? Not tonight. Storm's too heavy. In the morning, maybe. And the sheriff? The one in your notebook? He looked at his mother. He's the sheriff here? Yes, Eleanor said. So we can't go to him? No. James processed this. He looked at Cole. But you know other people. People who aren't owned by Pemberton. I know one man, Cole said. A federal marshal named Garrett. He's 3 days east in good weather. He paused. Weather's not good. But you can reach him. I can send a wire from Copper Falls. If Driscoll hasn't gotten to the telegraph operator first. Cole looked at Eleanor. That's the first move. First light, I ride into town and send the wire. Come back before Pemberton's men regroup. That leaves us alone here, James said. James, Eleanor started. I'm not complaining, the boy said. I'm assessing. He looked at Cole with those dark, direct eyes. What do we do if someone comes while you're gone? Cole leaned forward and looked at James McBride at 2:30 in the morning in a Montana blizzard and gave him the truth, because that was what the boy was asking for. There's a rifle under the bed, he said. Loaded. Your mother knows how to use it. He glanced at Eleanor. She nodded once, confirming. If anyone knocks on that door before I'm back, you don't answer. You don't open it. You move to the back wall with your sister, and you let your mother handle the door. He held the boy's eyes. Your job is your sister. Same as it's been. You understand? James held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he nodded. Go back to sleep, Eleanor said quietly. James lay back down. He put his arm across Clara again, automatic and deliberate at once. And within 4 minutes, his breathing had evened out. Cole didn't know how the boy did it. Switched off the alertness and went under, like a soldier who'd learned to sleep in the trenches because the alternative was to not sleep at all. Eleanor looked at her son for a long moment after he was asleep. Something in her face in that moment was unguarded, in the way faces go when they think no one is watching. Not grief exactly, not pride exactly, but the intersection of both. The expression of a mother who has watched her child become something remarkable under terrible circumstances and doesn't know whether to be grateful or heartbroken about it. Cole didn't look away. He didn't think she'd want him to pretend he hadn't seen it. He's 8 years old, she said quietly. I know. He was 6 when Thomas started having problems at the mine. He's been watching me be afraid for 2 years. She picked up the pencil. He's never once let me see him be afraid himself. He's afraid, Cole said. He's just decided it's not useful. That's what I'm saying. She looked at the notebook. He shouldn't have had to decide that. Cole didn't argue with her. She was right, and they both knew it, and there was nothing useful to add. He got up and went to the cedar chest, the one with the blankets, his mother's cedar chest, and knelt beside it and lifted the false bottom he'd built into it the first winter, because old habits from the Pinkerton years didn't entirely leave a man, even when he wanted them to. He took out the files. They were in an oilskin envelope, tied with twine, as intact as the day he'd walked out of the Chicago office and carried them under his arm to the train station. He set them on the table. Eleanor looked at them. She didn't reach for them. She looked at him first. "Are you sure?" "I've been sure for 2 years," he said. "I just hadn't decided to do anything about it." She untied the twine and opened the oilskin and looked at the first photograph. He watched her face. She was looking at the shaft supports, the cuts in the timber, the places where the bracing had been removed to save money on lumber. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, with that fast, comprehensive attention that took in the whole shape before focusing on the parts. Then she looked at the testimony pages and began to read. She read for 40 minutes without speaking. Cole put more wood on the fire and made hot water and put a cup beside her, and she drank it without looking up. The blizzard outside began its slow transition toward dawn. Not lighter yet, but different. The quality of the dark changing from black to the gray-blue that precedes the first pale suggestion of morning in a Montana winter. When she finished, she set the last page down and sat with her hands flat on the table. "His name," she said. "The foreman who gave the order to remove the bracing. Marcus Holt." "Yes." "He's in Thomas's notebook." She didn't look up. "He's still working for Pemberton. He runs the operation at the new site north of Billings." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "He gave the order at Colville, and 7 men died, and he is currently supervising 300 workers at a new shaft." "I know." She looked at him. "This has to end." "Yes." "I mean all of it. Not just Pemberton in a courtroom. Holt, Driscoll, every name in that column. All of it." "That's what federal courts are for," he said. "That's why we need Garrett." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Cole, what if Garrett's bought too?" It was the right question. The question he'd been sitting with since she'd said Driscoll's name. The question a person asks when they've been living inside a system of corruption long enough to stop assuming the next person is clean. "He might be," Cole said honestly. "But I've watched Garrett work for 12 years, and I've never seen him take a dollar that wasn't his. And I've seen men try." He met her eyes. "Some people aren't buyable. Not because they're saints, because they're too angry to be. Garrett's got a dead brother in a mine collapse in Pennsylvania, and he's been angry about it since 1869. Pemberton would have to offer him more than money to buy that particular man." Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment. Then something settled in her. Not relaxation, not quite. The specific settlement of someone who has made a decision and stopped second-guessing it. "Send the wire at first light," she said. "First light." She picked up the pencil and went back to copying. Cole leaned back in his chair and kept watch over the room. The children sleeping, the fire holding, the notebook and the files spread across the table like the pieces of something that had been broken deliberately and was being put back together by 2 people who had both been standing on the outside of it, each holding a different half, for 2 years without knowing the other existed. He didn't sleep. He didn't need to. Something had shifted in him in the last 3 hours. Some mechanism that had been seized up with rust and disuse had started turning again, and the feeling was not comfortable. It was the feeling of a thing working that has been broken for a long time. All effort and friction and the particular ache of relearning motion. But it was working. At the first gray suggestion of dawn, he reached for his coat. Eleanor looked up. "I'll be back before the 2nd hour," he said. She nodded once, then, "Cole," he stopped. "The telegraph operator in Copper Falls. His name is Everett Kane. He's 60 years old, and he has a daughter in Billings, and he used to bring her candy every Sunday before Pemberton's foreman ran her husband out of work for filing a complaint about shaft conditions. She held his eyes. He is not owned by Pemberton. Tell him Eleanor McBride sent you. He'll know. Cole looked at her. Thomas, he said. Thomas, she confirmed. He knew everyone. Cole pulled his coat on and took the rifle from beside the door. He looked once more at the table, the notebook, the files, the 2 stacks of copied pages weighted down by the tin cups. At Eleanor McBride, sitting straight-backed in the low light of a Montana winter dawn, pencil moving, 8 months along, 2 sleeping children at her back, her dead husband's work spread out in front of her, like a map she intended to follow all the way to the end. He opened the door. The cold came in immediate and total. Behind him, without looking up, Eleanor said, "Don't let Driscoll see you." "No, ma'am." He stepped out into the gray dawn and pulled the door shut, and the bolt slid home behind him, both locks, top and bottom. And he stood for a moment in the first pale light of the storm's aftermath, the snow deep and still and covering everything clean, and he thought about a foreman named Holt, and a sheriff named Driscoll, and a man in an office in Billings who had been buying safety inspectors since 1875 and calling the deaths of working men accidents. And he thought about Thomas McBride writing instructions to his wife by lamplight, knowing he was running out of time. And he thought about 7 names that had been written and erased and carried in secret by 2 different people in 2 different places for 2 years. He walked to the barn, saddled Pepper, and rode toward Copper Falls in the gray light while the snow held its breath and the world looked clean and wasn't. Everett Kane was already at his desk when Cole pushed through the telegraph office door, which meant he hadn't slept either, which meant word had already moved through Copper Falls the way word moves through small towns in the dark. Not by telegraph, but by whisper, by curtain, by the particular language of people who've learned to watch without appearing to watch. The old man looked up. He had a coffee cup in one hand and a pencil in the other, and the expression of someone who had been expecting a visitor he wasn't sure he wanted. Cole shut the door behind him and stood dripping snowmelt on the floorboards. "Eleanor McBride sent me," he said. Everett Kane set down the coffee cup. Something moved across his face. Not surprise, not relief. Recognition. The specific recognition of a man who has been holding a door open in his mind for months and has just heard the knock he was waiting for. "Sit down," Kane said, "and talk quiet. Driscoll's deputy sleeps above the hardware store across the street, and that man is a light sleeper and a dedicated gossip." Cole sat. He kept his voice low and said what needed to be said in the order it needed to be said. The woman, the children, the notebook, the files, the wire that needed to go to Marshal Garrett in Billings before Pemberton's men regrouped and figured out where Eleanor had spent the night. Kane listened without interrupting. He was the kind of man who listened the way good telegraph operators listen, taking in everything, missing nothing, waiting until the full message was received before he responded. When Cole finished, Kane picked up his pencil and turned to his pad. "Garrett's not in Billings," he said. Cole went still. "He passed through here 4 days ago, heading north. Storm caught him at Ridgeline Station." Kane wrote as he talked. "I got a wire from Ridgeline's operator yesterday morning. Garrett's pinned down, same as everyone else." He looked up. "But he's 2 hours north, not 3 days east. And he's been waiting on a reason to move since he got stuck there." A pause. "I may have mentioned to Ridgeline's operator that there was some unusual activity in the Copper Falls district that might be of federal interest." Cole looked at him. "You already knew about Eleanor." "I knew a woman was being hunted on the East Ridge Road 2 days ago. My granddaughter saw the lanterns from her bedroom window." He kept writing. I've been waiting for someone to come through that door with a name I recognized." He tore the message off the pad and held it up. "This goes to Garrett in the next 5 minutes. If he moves at first light, he can be here before noon. Driscoll doesn't monitor my transmissions." Kane's voice went flat and certain. "He thinks he does. I've been sending him a version of my log every week for 8 months that is accurate in every detail except the ones that matter." He held Cole's eyes. "My daughter's husband was a good man who asked one question too many about shaft conditions. We don't all of us have the luxury of walking away to Montana, Mr. Hargrove." Cole held that. He held it without flinching, because it was true, and Kane had earned the right to say it. "Send the wire," Cole said. Kane sent it. Cole was back at the ranch inside the hour, before the snow on the main road had been disturbed by anything heavier than wind. He tied Pepper in the barn and went to the door and knocked twice, paused, knocked 3 times. The bolt slid back, top first, then bottom, and Eleanor opened the door with the rifle at her side, barrel down, and looked at him with a question she didn't need to speak. "Garrett's 2 hours north," he said. "Pinned at Ridgeline. Kane wired him. He should be here by noon." Something moved through Eleanor's face. Quick, controlled, gone in a second. "Kane knew." "He's been waiting." She stepped back to let him in. The cabin had changed in the hour he'd been gone. The files and the notebook were no longer on the table. The table was clean. James was at the window with Deputy beside him, both of them looking south with the same steady attention. Clara was awake, sitting cross-legged on the blankets, eating a piece of dried biscuit she'd apparently found in Cole's supply shelf and appointed herself guardian of. "There's a man at the south tree line," James said, without turning from the window. "He's been there about 20 minutes, not moving." Cole crossed to the window and looked. The boy was right. A single figure, standing in the tree line 200 yards south, not advancing, not retreating. Watching. "One," Cole said. "That I can see," James said. Cole looked at him. The boy had said exactly what a trained man would say. "That I can see. Not just one." He looked at Eleanor. "They're not moving yet," she said. "They're waiting for Driscoll." "Or for their numbers to arrive." Cole stepped back from the window. "Either way, they come before Garrett gets here. We need to be ready." He looked at James. "Same as we talked about. Back wall. Your sister." "I heard you the first time," James said. "Not disrespectful. Factual." "James." Eleanor's voice was quiet and direct. "Take Clara to the back room, now. Not because something's happening. Because I need to talk to Cole, and I need to know where you are." The boy looked at his mother, then at Cole. Then he got up, took his sister by the hand. She took her biscuit with her without complaint, and walked them both to the back room. He closed the door without being asked. Eleanor turned to Cole. "How many men does Pemberton have in this district?" "That I know of? 6 rode through Copper Falls. There could be more." He checked the rifle. "But Pemberton's not going to come himself. He doesn't get his hands on things. He sends paperwork first and men second. And when the paperwork doesn't work, he sends more men." "The paperwork won't work," Eleanor said. "He doesn't have anything on me legally. Thomas's employment was terminated when he died. I'm not under any contract. The notebook is Thomas's private property." She looked at Cole. "He can have Driscoll threaten you for harboring something, but he can't—" "He doesn't need it to be legal," Cole said. "He needs it to be done before Garrett arrives." The understanding settled between them without ceremony. Outside, the figure in the tree line still hadn't moved. Deputy had positioned himself at the front door, with a particular stillness that was different from his usual stillness. Not sleeping, not resting. Coiled. The dog had done this before, years ago in the field, and Cole had learned to read it as reliable. "Your shoulder," Cole said. "How is it this morning?"
Manageable.
"The baby." She met his eyes.
Moving. More than last night.
The relief that moved through him was disproportionate to how well he knew her, and he was aware of that, and set it aside to think about later. "There's something I didn't tell you last night," she said. He waited. "When Thomas sent the letter, the one telling me where to go, he included one other name." She folded her hands. "Not a person to find, a person to avoid." She looked at the door. "He wrote that if I made it as far as the Montana Territory, there was one man whose help would be worth more than any other. One man who had the documentation, the credibility, and the motive to stand in a federal court and make the Colville case unignorable." She paused. "He wrote your name." Cole was quiet. "He wrote it with a specific instruction," she said. "He said, 'Find Cole Hargrove, and when you find him, tell him that Thomas McBride said the men of Colville are still waiting to be named in a document that stays named.'" The fire made a sound. Deputies' ears moved. Cole stood up and went to the window. The figure in the tree line had been joined by a second. They were still not advancing, but the configuration had changed. Spread wider, using the trees for cover in a way that wasn't casual anymore. "They're positioning," he said. Eleanor was beside him in 3 steps. She looked. "How long?" 10 minutes, maybe less." He turned. "The files, where'd you put them?" "Same place you had them." She moved to the cedar chest and knelt and lifted the false bottom, and he saw his oilskin envelope alongside the notebook and the 2 copied stacks, all of them nested together in the cedar-smelling dark. She replaced the board and stood up. "If they come in, they won't find it on a fast search." "It's not a fast search I'm worried about." He picked up the rifle. "Eleanor." She turned. "I need you to do something that's going to go against every instinct you have." She crossed her arms and looked at him with an expression that said she was listening but was not pre-committing. "When they come, and they're coming, badge or no badge, legal paper or not, I need you to let me answer the door. Not stand behind it, not hold the rifle. Let me take the front and trust me to hold the line long enough for Garrett to arrive."
And if Garrett doesn't arrive in time?
"Then I'll hold it anyway."
With what authority? You're a rancher. You have no badge. You have no—
"I have the original Colville documentation and a witness testimony and your husband's notebook in a cedar chest. And when Garrett walks through that door, every piece of paper in this building becomes federal evidence, and everyone who tried to get to it before he arrived becomes a federal problem." He held her eyes. "But only if we're all still standing when he gets here." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. The calculation behind her eyes was visible, not because she was slow at it, but because she was thorough. And thorough people don't hide the process. They just move through it faster than most. "All right," she said. "All right?" "I said all right." She moved to the backroom door. "James!" The door opened immediately. The boy had been standing on the other side of it. "Come here." James came. Eleanor knelt in front of her son, put her hands on his shoulders, and looked at him straight. "I need you to listen to me very carefully." "I always listen carefully," he said. "I know you do." Her voice was steady and low and completely honest. "There are men outside who work for the man who killed your father. They want what's in the chest. They're not going to get it because Cole is going to make sure of that. But I need you to stay in the back room with your sister, and I need you to keep her calm, and I need you to trust me." James looked at his mother, then at Cole.
"The marshal's coming," Cole said. 2 hours, maybe less. We just need the clock to run."
The boy absorbed this. 8 years old, doing the math on something no 8-year-old should have to do math on. Then he straightened up. That particular straightening Cole had noticed the first night. The deliberate gathering of posture that was the boy's version of his mother's jaw set. And he nodded. "Don't let them in," James said to Cole. "No, sir," Cole said. James went back to his sister and closed the door. They didn't have to wait long. The knock came 12 minutes later, hard, official. The knock of a man with a badge, or a man pretending to have one. Cole was already at the door. Eleanor was at the table, with her hands visible and the rifle leaning against the wall 6 feet away. Close enough to reach, far enough to not provoke. Cole opened the door. Sheriff Harlan Driscoll stood on the porch with 2 men behind him, and the particular expression of a man who has been given an unpleasant job and has decided the way through it is to do it fast. He was in his 50s, heavy, with a badge that caught the gray morning light, and the eyes of a man who had sold his conscience for something he now wished he could price differently. Cole said nothing. He held the door and waited. "Morning, Cole." Driscoll's voice had the careful flatness of a performance. "I've got a warrant, signed by Judge Alderman himself in Billings. Searching for a woman named Eleanor McBride, wanted for theft of proprietary documents belonging to Pemberton Mining Company." He held out the paper. Cole looked at it without taking it. "You seen anyone on the road last 2 days?" Driscoll said. "Woman, dark hair, pregnant, traveling with children." "Road's been closed, Harlan," Cole said. "Blizzard." Driscoll's jaw tightened. "I'll need to look inside."
"You got a search warrant to go with that retrieval warrant?"
Driscoll stopped, a beat too long. Behind him, the 2 men shifted.
"Because a retrieval warrant is for retrieving a person," Cole said, "not for searching a private residence. You want to search my house, you need a separate warrant from a separate judge, and the nearest judge who isn't alderman is 3 days east." He held Driscoll's eyes. "You know that, Harlan. You've been a lawman long enough to know that." Driscoll looked at him, and in the look was something Cole had seen before, in men who are standing at the exact moment where the thing they've been doing and the thing they know is right diverge completely, and they have to choose which road they're on. "Cole," Driscoll said quietly. The performance had dropped out of his voice. "Don't make this harder." "I'm not making anything harder. I'm standing in my doorway in my own house." Cole kept his voice even.
"The question is what you're making harder, Harlan, and who you're making it harder for." One of the men behind Driscoll, younger, with the particular impatience of someone who has been told to wait too many times, stepped forward. "Sheriff, the warrant covers—" "Stand back," Driscoll said sharply. The man stopped. Driscoll looked at Cole, and something moved across his face that was not courage, but was the shadow courage leaves behind after it's been gone for too long. "I got a daughter," he said. It came out low, barely above the wind. "Pemberton's got paper on my house. If I don't—" "I know," Cole said. And he did. He'd known the moment he'd seen Driscoll's name in the notebook, and the $400 figure beside it, and the date. The same month Driscoll's daughter had been sick, and the doctor bills had been real, and the man who offered to pay them hadn't presented himself as a devil. "I know how it started, Harlan." Driscoll's face did something complicated and brief and painful. "There's a federal marshal on the road right now," Cole said. 2 hours out, maybe less. When he gets here, what you do in the next 2 hours is going to matter more than what you did in the last 2 years. He held the older man's eyes. "You know what's in that notebook. You know your name is in it. And you know that a federal court is going to look very different at a sheriff who stepped back from an illegal search than at one who kicked in a door. The wind moved between them. The younger man behind Driscoll reached for his holster. The sound that stopped him was not Cole's rifle. It was Deputy, who had been silent at the door this entire time and chose this moment to place himself at Cole's left side and produce a sound from somewhere in his aging chest that was entirely inconsistent with his 13 years and general air of dignified retirement. The man's hand stopped moving. "Don't," Driscoll said to his man, quietly, firmly. The voice of a man making a decision he'd been avoiding for 2 years. He folded the warrant. He put it inside his coat. He looked at Cole one last time with an expression that was hard to name. Not quite shame, not quite relief. Something in between that had no word for it because most people don't have occasion to feel it. 2 hours, he said. 2 hours, Cole confirmed. Driscoll turned. He walked off the porch and past his 2 men without looking at them. And after a moment, they followed. And Cole stood in the doorway and watched until the 3 of them had mounted and started back down the south road before he let out the breath he'd been managing since the knock. Eleanor was standing 3 feet behind him. "You heard," he said. "I heard." She was holding the rifle, not in a threatening way, just holding it. His daughter. It's how Pemberton works. He finds the place a man is weak, and he helps with it. And then he owns the debt. Cole closed the door. It's clean, it's patient, and it makes it very hard for the man to walk back out. Because the moment he took the help is the moment he can't prove his hands are clean anymore. Thomas wrote about it, Eleanor said. He called it architecture. Pemberton builds a structure of obligation around a man, and then when he needs the man to do something, the structure does the work. She set the rifle down. He said the only way to collapse the architecture is to make the cost of staying inside it higher than the cost of walking out. That's what just happened, Cole said. She looked at the door. Driscoll could still wire Pemberton, she said. He could, but he didn't search this house when he had enough men to do it, and I had only a rifle and a dog. That tells me something about which way he's leaning. The back room door opened, and James came out first, Clara behind him eating what appeared to be the remainder of her biscuit with serene unconcern. They left? James asked. They left, Cole said. Clara looked at Deputy, then at Cole, then at her mother. Deputy was very loud, she said approvingly. He was, Cole agreed. Clara went to Deputy and sat down beside him on the floor, with the authority of a child who has decided an animal belongs to her and is simply waiting for the animal to catch up. Deputy looked at her with one eye, and then put his head back down on his paws, which was as close to welcome as he'd offered anyone in years. Eleanor put her hand on James's shoulder. The boy leaned into it slightly, just slightly, the fraction of lean that a child allows when they've been holding themselves straight for too long, and find a moment when they don't have to. The next 2 hours were the longest Cole had spent in the cabin since the first winter he'd moved in, and the isolation had been a choice. And then, slowly, and then, all at once, a sentence he was serving for something he couldn't entirely name. He fed the horses. He checked the perimeter twice. He came back and found Eleanor at the table, not writing, for the first time, just sitting with her hands around a cup and her eyes on the middle distance. "What do you want to do after?" he asked. She looked up. "After what?" "After Garrett. After the federal case. After Pemberton's name is on a document that doesn't get buried." He sat down. "What does Eleanor McBride do then?" She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands, at the ink that was still faint on her right knuckle from the night's copying, at the pencil callus on her middle finger that he'd noticed the first night. "I want to teach," she said. It came out simple and certain, the way people state the things they've never stopped wanting, even through everything that tried to stop them. I want to find somewhere with children who need a teacher, and I want to do the thing I was doing before Thomas brought me west. She paused. I want Clara to grow up knowing she can read anything, any document, any contract. A beat. I want James to know that there are systems worth believing in because someone made them worth believing in. That's a lot of wanting for one person. I've been putting it off, she said simply. Cole looked at her, at the woman who had set her shoulder and walked through a blizzard and spent the night copying evidence and faced down a sheriff's knock without moving from the table, and still hadn't once asked anyone to feel sorry for her. I think Thomas McBride, Cole said slowly, was the kind of man who would have liked knowing you ended up somewhere with a good school and a door that locked from inside, and children who knew your name. Eleanor held his eyes for a long moment. Her chin moved, just slightly, the fraction of movement that happens when someone is holding something in and succeeds. He would have liked knowing I wasn't running anymore, she said. The sound of hooves came from the North Road. Not Pemberton's pattern, not a sweep, not a careful, quiet approach. Steady, purposeful, the sound of men on a road with authority and intention, and no reason to pretend otherwise. Cole was at the window before the sound fully registered. 3 horses. 4. A badge catching the noon light. Deputy stood up. Clara, still sitting on the floor beside him, looked up at Cole and then at her mother, and then at the door. "Is that the good man?" she asked. Eleanor crossed to the window and looked. Something moved through her face that had been building for 8 months and 4 days and one very long night in a Montana blizzard. Not relief. Not triumph. The specific, terrible, enormous thing that happens when a person who has been surviving stops needing to survive and starts being able to breathe again. "Yes, baby," she said. "That's the good man." Cole opened the door. Marshal Thomas Garrett rode into the yard with 3 deputies behind him, snow still on his coat, looking like a man who had been waiting at a station for 4 days for exactly this reason, and had ridden the moment the wire came in without stopping for breakfast or apology. He pulled his horse up at the porch and looked at Cole, and then past Cole at Eleanor standing in the doorway. "Mrs. McBride," he said. "Marshal," she said. "I understand you have documentation pertaining to Pemberton Mining Company, the Colville shaft collapse, and related matters." "I have Thomas's notebook, 2 complete copies, and Cole Hargrove's original Colville investigative files." She said it clear and level, every word placed precisely. 73 pages of evidence total. Garrett looked at Cole. "The original files," he said. It wasn't a question, but it wanted confirmation. "In the cedar chest," Cole said. "Intact." Garrett dismounted. He was a compact, deliberate man with tired eyes that missed nothing, and the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who have been angry for a very long time and learned to do useful things with it. "Then I reckon," he said, "we have some work to do." He stepped up onto the porch, and Cole stepped aside, and Marshal Thomas Garrett walked into the cabin where the evidence was waiting. And outside, the snow held its clean, false silence over everything. And inside, the cedar chest, the names of 7 men from Colville, lay in an oilskin envelope, alongside the testimony of 1 woman who had refused to grieve quietly. And the only thing left now was the hard, necessary, overdue work of making sure those names stayed written. Garrett worked the way Cole remembered good investigators working. Without theater, without announcement, just methodical and thorough, and completely indifferent to how long it took. He sat at the table and read every page of Thomas's notebook. Then he read Cole's original Colville files. Then he read the copied stacks Eleanor had made through the night. He didn't ask questions while he read. He made marks in his own small notebook with a pencil stub he'd pulled from his vest pocket. And when he finished one section, he set it carefully aside and picked up the next. Eleanor stood at the window. Cole put coffee on. Real coffee, from the saddlebag Garrett's deputy had carried in without being asked. Because federal marshals who'd ridden 2 hours through post-blizzard snow apparently understood the requirements of the situation better than Cole's own supply shelf did. Clara had appointed herself hostess of the coffee operation and was very seriously handing cups to people who were 3 times her height, with the focused dignity of a child who has found her role and intends to execute it properly. James sat at the far end of the table from Garrett and watched the marshal read. He didn't speak. He didn't fidget. He watched the way he watched everything, with that dark, patient attention. And after 40 minutes of this, Garrett looked up from the page he was reading and looked directly at James and said, "Your father wrote this?" "Yes, sir," James said. "He was an accountant." "Yes, sir." Garrett looked back at the page. "He wrote like a lawyer," he said. It was not a compliment or a criticism. It was an observation delivered with the respect of a professional recognizing craft in another field. He anticipated every counter-argument before it could be made. He documented not just what happened, but why the documentation itself was reliable. He turned to the next page. "Most witnesses give me what they saw. Your father gave me what he saw, why he could see it, why his position allowed him access to it, and why the records he copied were authentic and not fabricated." A pause. He knew this was going to a court. "He always knew," James said quietly. Garrett looked at the boy again. Something in the marshal's tired eyes moved. Just briefly. Just a fraction. Then he went back to reading. Eleanor turned from the window. "The names in the 3rd section," she said. "The buyers. 3 of them are in the Billings District Land Office." "I saw them." Garrett didn't look up. "Judge Alderman signed Driscoll's warrant this morning." "I know. Alderman's been on my list for 14 months. Garrett turned another page. He'd just moved to the top of it. Cole poured his own coffee and leaned against the wall near the door and let the marshal work. One of the deputies, the youngest one, a red-headed man named Fitch, who couldn't have been more than 22, had taken a position outside on the porch without being told to. The other 2 were with the horses. Nobody had said anything about Pemberton's men in the tree line, but everyone in the room understood they were still out there and were running their own clock. The question was, whose clock ran out first? "Mr. Hargrove." Garrett set down the last page. He stacked the papers with both hands, neat and deliberate, and looked at Cole. "Tell me about the night you wrote the original Colville report." Cole came to the table and sat down. He told it the same way he'd told Eleanor the night before. Straight, in order, without making himself the hero of it. The documentation he'd gathered, the testimony from the surviving miners, the copy of the inspection report. The night his supervisor had handed him back the cleaned version and told him to sign it. Garrett listened the same way he read. Complete attention, no interruption, the pencil moving occasionally in his small notebook. "The supervisor," Garrett said when Cole finished. "Harlan Beaumont, Chicago office." "Yes." "He's dead. 18 months ago." Garrett said it matter-of-factly. "Carriage accident in Illinois." A beat. "Pemberton has a man in Chicago whose job appears to be ensuring that people who know too much have carriage accidents at convenient times. We've been building that case separately." He looked at Cole. "Your original testimony connects the Chicago operation to the Montana operation. That's a federal conspiracy charge that supersedes every territorial jurisdiction Pemberton's bought." The room was quiet for a moment. "You've been building a case," Eleanor said from the window. Not accusing, clarifying. For 16 months, Garrett said. I had pieces, individual incidents, payments to inspectors in 2 territories, a pattern of accidents that stopped being statistically credible after the 4th one. He looked at her. What I didn't have was a central record, something that showed the structure, not just the individual corrupt acts, but the system connecting them, the architecture. He tapped Thomas's notebook. Your husband built me the architecture. Eleanor's hands were very still at her sides. He died for it. Yes, ma'am, he did. Garrett said it without softening it, because Eleanor McBride was not a woman who wanted her truth softened, and Garrett was apparently perceptive enough to know it. And what he built is going to bring down every pillar of that structure, from the inspectors in the bottom column to the men in the top one. He paused. But I need you to understand what comes next. Tell me. I'm going to arrest Augustus Pemberton. I have enough for that today, right now, and I intend to do it before he gets word that we're sitting in this cabin. He looked at the stack of papers. But Pemberton has lawyers in 3 territories and a judge already in his pocket in Billings. And the moment I bring him in, he's going to use every mechanism available to him to discredit this evidence and everyone connected to it. He held Eleanor's eyes. That means you, Mrs. McBride. They're going to come after your credibility, your history, your marriage, your husband's motives. They're going to say Thomas fabricated the records. They're going to say you fabricated the copies. They're going to find every soft spot in your past and press on it in open court. Eleanor crossed to the table and sat down. She put her hands flat on the surface the same way she'd put them flat the night before. The gesture of a woman grounding herself, taking inventory, deciding what she has to work with. I was a school teacher for 9 years, she said. I have references from 3 institutions and 17 years of a reputation for accuracy that any court can verify. She met Garrett's eyes. I'm 8 months pregnant with my 3rd child. I've been running for 4 days, and I spent last night hand-copying 73 pages of evidence by lamplight. I think my commitment to accuracy will be apparent. A pause. What else? Garrett almost smiled. It was brief, controlled, the smile of a man who doesn't do it often enough to be fluid at it. I need you in Billings for the federal hearing. 3 weeks, maybe 4. You'll testify to Thomas's documentation methods, your own copies, and your direct knowledge of his findings. He looked at Cole. I need you for the Colville files. Authentication of the original report, testimony about the night your supervisor presented the falsified version, and your direct knowledge of the inspection documents. When do you leave for Pemberton's operation? Cole asked. This afternoon. I want to hit his main office before the end of business day, before anyone who was in that tree line this morning gets back to him. Garrett stood. I'm leaving Fitch and Deputy Marshal Reyes here with you until you're ready to travel to Billings. Nobody moves on this cabin while I have 2 federal badges on the porch. Cole nodded. Clara, who had been listening to all of this from her position beside Deputy, with the focused attention she gave to everything, looked up at Garrett. Are you going to put the bad man in jail? She asked. Garrett looked down at her with the expression of a man who doesn't spend enough time around children to know the protocol, but is doing his best. Yes, miss, he said. Clara considered this. Good, she said, with the settled finality of a verdict delivered and a matter closed, and went back to Deputy. Garrett gathered the papers. He was careful with them, stacked in the order he'd read them, the originals separate from the copies, each stack wrapped in the oilskin Cole provided. He put them inside his coat with the specific, practiced motion of a man who has been carrying sensitive documents for 12 years and knows the safest place for them is next to his body. He was almost to the door when Eleanor said, Marshal. He stopped. "There's a man named Marcus Holt," she said. "He's currently running Pemberton's operation north of Billings. He gave the order to remove the bracing at Colville." She said it level and direct, the way she said everything that cost her. "He's still working. He's still giving orders. There were 300 men in that shaft." Garrett turned. "He's in the notebook?" Page 14. Payments from Pemberton to Holt, dated 6 weeks before the collapse. Specifically described as compensation for operational adjustments. She held the marshal's eyes. Thomas believed operational adjustments was Pemberton's language for removing safety measures. "It was," Cole said. 3 of the surviving miners used the same phrase in their testimony. They were told they were making operational adjustments. Garrett took out his small notebook and wrote for 15 seconds. Then he looked up. "I'll have a deputy at the north shaft by tomorrow morning." A pause. "Thank you, Mrs. McBride." "Thank Thomas," she said.
Garrett put his hat on and went out the door, and outside they heard him give quiet instructions to his deputies, and then the sound of horses moving south at a purposeful pace. And then it was just the cabin, and Fitch on the porch, and the 2 remaining deputies, and the specific quality of silence that follows when the thing that's been building for a long time has finally been set in motion and cannot be called back. James looked at his mother. "Is it over?" he asked. Eleanor looked at the door, then at her son. She was quiet for a moment, the honest quiet of a woman who will not give her child false comfort, but is choosing her truthful words carefully. "The hardest part is starting to be over," she said. "What comes next is different hard." James processed this. "Testimony," he said. "Yes." "You'll have to say everything in court." "Yes." The boy nodded slowly. He looked at Cole. "Will you be there?" Cole looked at the boy, and at the woman, and at the sleeping dog, and the small girl who had renamed the dog and claimed him without ceremony, and at the table where the notebook had sat for 2 days, like a beating heart the whole story was organized around. "Yes," he said. "I'll be there." James nodded once, the same decisive nod he'd given the first night, and went back to his sister. The afternoon passed slowly. Fitch was 22 and from Ohio, and had a quality of careful politeness that suggested he'd been raised by people who put stock in manners, and he intended to honor that, even in a Montana ranch house in the aftermath of a blizzard. He offered to help with the horses. Cole let him. They worked in the barn for an hour, and Fitch talked. Not nervously, just steadily, the way young men talk when they're in a situation that's bigger than their experience, and filling the space with words feels like doing something useful. He talked about the Garrett case, about being deputized 6 months ago, about his older brother who worked a mine in Ohio, and who he wrote to every week. Cole listened and worked, and thought about the fact that Fitch's brother worked a mine, and Fitch was 22, and riding for a federal marshal who was trying to make mines safer. And the boy probably hadn't fully connected those 2 facts yet, but would, someday, in a quiet moment that would matter more than he knew. When they came back inside, Eleanor was at the table again, not writing this time. She had Thomas's notebook open in front of her, not the evidence pages, the back of it, the pages Thomas had used for personal notes. Cole could see from across the room that the handwriting on these pages was different from the accounting entries, looser, more like letters. He didn't ask about it. She closed it when she heard them come in. Not quickly, not hiding it, just closing it the way a person closes something private when other people enter the room. "Clara's asleep again," she said. "James is reading." She looked at Cole. "You have a surveying textbook from 1871 on your shelf." "My father's." "James found it and has been reading it for 2 hours,
and has asked me 4 questions about land measurement that I couldn't answer. Something in her voice, not quite humor, but the warmth that humor grows from. He may have a future in surveying. Or law, Cole said. Boy thinks like a lawyer. He thinks like Thomas. She said it without the careful flatness she usually used for Thomas's name. Just said it, present tense in meaning, if not in grammar. The way people talk about someone who is gone, but not absent. Cole sat down across from her. The fire had found its evening rhythm. Fitch had taken his post outside again, with the earnest conscientiousness of a young man who understood his assignment. Somewhere south, Garrett was riding toward Augustus Pemberton's main office with federal papers and 3 deputies and 73 pages of a dead man's meticulous truth. "Can I ask you something?" Cole said. Eleanor looked at him. "The night of the wagon. The ridge." He held her eyes. "You had the knife in the board before I arrived. You were using it to stand up." He paused. "You weren't going to stay down." "No," she said. "What was the plan?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I was going to get the children moving north on foot and draw the men with the lanterns south. I had the rifle. It went into the snow when the wagon rolled, but I knew where it was. I was going to get the children far enough that the lanterns would follow me instead." Her hands were flat on the table. "I hadn't worked out what happened after that part." "That's not a plan," Cole said. "That's a sacrifice." "It's what was available." She held his gaze without apology. "I had 2 children and a notebook, and men 30 yards above me. You work with what you have." "You work with what you have," Cole repeated quietly. He looked at the cedar chest. "Thomas wrote a letter telling you exactly how to survive this? And you read it and memorized it, and did every single thing it said. And when it ran out, when the instructions stopped, and you were on that ridge with the wagon on its side and no road left, you made your own instructions." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "What else was I going to do?" she said. It wasn't rhetorical. It was the genuine question of a woman who has never been able to identify the moment where another option existed. "Nothing," Cole said. "There wasn't anything else." He looked at her. "I'm not telling you it was wrong. I'm telling you I saw it, and I want you to know I saw it. Because people who do things like that in the dark, with no witness, tend to forget they did them later, when the crisis is over, and the ordinary world comes back and makes the extraordinary thing feel like it must have been smaller than it was." Eleanor held very still. "It wasn't small," Cole said. "What you did on that ridge, what you've done for 4 days, what Thomas did for 2 years before you, none of it was small. And I want somebody to have said that out loud before the federal courthouse makes it official, and the lawyers make it language, and the record makes it history." He met her eyes. "It was extraordinary. You are extraordinary. And Thomas McBride knew that when he married you, and he knew it when he wrote those instructions, and he knew it was true, even if he didn't make it out to see it finished." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Not the controlled quiet, not the strategic quiet. The quiet that happens when something has been said that was true and large, and there are no words that are the right size to put next to it. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but the steadiness had a different quality than usual. It was not the steadiness of control. It was the steadiness of someone who has been holding something alone for a very long time and has just been allowed to put it down. "He used to say," she said, "that I was the only person he'd ever met who is more afraid of failing the important things than of the consequences of fighting for them." She looked at the closed notebook. "He said that like it was a compliment. It took me a long time to understand that it was." Cole said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be better than the silence. Outside, the sky had moved from gray to the deep blue of a Montana winter evening. And in the north, the first stars were becoming visible above the snow line, hard and clear and very far away. Fitch had come in and was eating cold biscuits at the corner of the table with the uncomplaining pragmatism of a young deputy who understood that field work did not involve warm suppers. James had come out of the back room with a surveying textbook and was asking Fitch questions about land measurement with the targeted curiosity of a boy who has found an unexplored topic and intends to exhaust it. Clara woke up, took inventory of the room, approved of the general situation, and asked for more biscuit. Cole made biscuits. It was the most ordinary hour the cabin had contained in the 3 days since a woman with a dislocated shoulder and a leather bag and 2 children had knocked snow from her boots and come inside. And there was something in the ordinariness that was its own kind of remarkable. The specific ordinary that only exists on the other side of something extraordinary. When the storm has passed, and the danger is not gone, but is manageable, and the fire is warm, and the children are asking about surveying, and the coffee is real. Eleanor sat at the table and drank her coffee, and didn't write, and didn't copy, and didn't plan. She just sat and drank her coffee, and watched her children, and occasionally looked at Cole with an expression he was learning to read. Not a simple expression, not reducible to one thing, but somewhere in the neighborhood of, I was alone in this for a very long time, and now I am not. And I am not yet sure what to do with that. But I am keeping careful note of it. He could read that expression because he was having a version of it himself. After the children were asleep and Fitch had taken his post and Reyes was with the horses, Cole sat on the porch in the cold and thought about Billings, about federal court, about standing in a room and saying clearly and on record what had happened at Colville, and what had been done about it, and what should have been done, and what he should have done in the years between. He thought about whether he was ready for that, and decided the question of readiness was not the point. The point was whether it was necessary. That question had been settled in the snow on the East Ridge Road when a woman who couldn't afford to stay down had driven a knife into a wagon board and used it to stand up anyway. The door opened behind him. Eleanor came out in her coat, moving carefully with the weight of 8 months, and stood at the porch rail and looked at the stars. They stood there for a while in the cold without speaking, which was its own kind of conversation. The kind that 2 people can only have when they've been through something together that has made small talk feel like a category error. 3 weeks in Billings, she said finally. 3 weeks, he agreed. After that, she looked at the stars, not asking, thinking out loud, which he'd noticed was the way she worked through things that mattered. She said the pieces in order until the shape of the whole became visible. The children need a settled place, a school, something that doesn't move. Montana's a good territory for schools, Cole said. Federal land grants have been building them since '72. She glanced at him. You've been looking into that. I read, he said simply. She looked back at the stars. Copper Falls has a school? Had one. Closed last spring when the teacher left for Denver. Building's still standing. He paused. Town's been trying to find a replacement for 8 months. The silence that followed had a shape to it. Cole, she said. Ma'am? Are you telling me about a school, or are you telling me about a reason to stay? He looked at the stars the way she was looking at them, directly, without pretense. I reckon I'm telling you both, he said, and letting you decide which one answers your question. Eleanor was quiet for a long time. The night was very cold and very clear. The kind of clear that only comes after a blizzard has scrubbed the sky clean. And the stars were the hard, bright stars of high altitude and deep winter. "The baby's going to need a name," she said. "That's true. I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks, and I haven't settled on one." She looked down at her hands on the porch rail. "Thomas had a name picked out, before. He told me in a letter." She paused. "He said if it was a girl, he wanted to name her for the first honest thing that happened after everything dishonest." She looked at Cole. "He wrote that before he knew how it ended, before the notebook was finished. He was writing about the hope of it, not the fact." Her voice was very quiet. "He never got to see the fact." Cole looked at her, at the woman who had been keeping herself in motion for 8 months, on precision and will and the specific stubbornness of someone who was more afraid of failing the important things than of the consequences of fighting for them. At the woman who was going to stand in a federal courthouse in 3 weeks and say everything that needed to be said in the room where it would finally matter. "What was the name?" he asked. "Varity," she said. "It means truth." The wind moved between them, cold and clean off the snowfields, carrying the particular silence of a Montana winter night, deep and still, and full of the specific promise of things that had been buried under all that clean white, waiting to be found. "That's a good name," Cole said. Eleanor looked at the stars for another moment. Then she put her hand on the porch rail and turned to go back inside, and Cole held the door for her, and the warmth of the cabin came out to meet them both, and inside the children slept, and the fire held, and the notebook sat in the cedar chest alongside the 7 names that were finally, after all this time, in a document that was going to stay named. They left for Billings 4 days later, when the roads were clear enough to travel, and Eleanor's shoulder had healed enough that she could manage the wagon reins without Cole watching her every 3rd minute with the expression she'd started calling his accounting face, the look he got when he was adding up variables and didn't like the total. Garrett had sent word the morning after his departure. Pemberton had been arrested at his main office without incident, which Garrett described in his wire as disappointing, because a man who had arranged the deaths of at least 9 people over 4 years should have put up more of a fight than a man who simply sat down when the badge came through the door and asked for his lawyer. Holt had been taken at the North Shaft. The 300 workers had been sent home with pay. Federal order, Garrett's signature, while the shaft was inspected by men whose signatures hadn't been purchased in advance. Driscoll had come to the ranch the morning before they left. He came alone, without his deputies, without his badge pinned to his coat. And he stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and looked at Cole with the expression of a man who has spent several days in a room alone with his own history, and has come out the other side of it with something that cost him considerably. "I want to speak to Mrs. McBride," he said. Cole looked at him for a moment. Then he stepped inside and said her name, and she came to the door and stood in the frame with her coat on and her hands quiet at her sides, and looked at Harlan Driscoll without helping him. "I knew about the notebook," Driscoll said. "Not the details. But I knew Thomas McBride had been keeping records, and I knew Pemberton wanted them." He turned his hat once in his hands. "When they told me he'd had an accident in the shaft, I filed the report they gave me. I didn't ask questions I already knew the answers to." He looked at her directly, which appeared to cost him something. "I'm sorry, Mrs. McBride, for the report, for this morning, for all of it." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Cole could see her deciding, not whether to accept the apology, but what the apology was actually worth, and what she was going to do with it. "Did you have a choice?" she asked. Not cruelly. The honest question of a woman who understood the architecture Thomas had written about. "Not a good one," Driscoll said. "But I had one." She held his eyes. Then I accept your apology, Sheriff. And I'd suggest that when the federal court asks you about the warrant you served at this ranch, you tell them exactly what you told me just now. A pause. A man who had a bad choice and made it is different from a man who had a bad choice and made it, and then told the truth about it afterward. The court will know the difference. Driscoll nodded slowly. He put his hat back on. He looked at Cole once more, not asking for anything, just acknowledging the look of two men on opposite sides of a line that had been redrawn, and both of them aware of which side they were now on. And then he walked off the porch and mounted his horse and rode back toward town. Cole came to stand beside Eleanor in the doorway. "That was generous," he said. "It was accurate," she said. "There's a difference." She went back inside. "Are the horses ready?" The road to Billings took 2 days. Fitch rode escort for the first day and handed them to a second deputy at the district line who rode the second day. Clara sang to herself for most of both days, a song she appeared to be composing in real time, with lyrics that concerned deputy primarily and were revised every 40 minutes. James sat beside his mother on the wagon bench and watched the territory pass with the attention of someone memorizing a route they intend to travel again. Cole rode alongside. On the second evening, when they were close enough to Billings that the lights of the town were visible in the distance, Eleanor said without preamble, "Thomas proposed to me in a schoolroom." Cole looked at her. "I was correcting examinations at my desk. He'd come to fix the stovepipe." He was terrible at fixing stovepipes. It took him 3 separate visits over 2 weeks to get it right. The warmth in her voice was the warmth of a memory that is painful and dear at the same time. That specific combination that doesn't have a clean name. "The third visit, he told me he'd been deliberately making it worse between visits, so he'd have a reason to come back." She looked ahead at the lights. "I told him that was the most inefficient courtship method I had ever witnessed. He said efficient wasn't the point. The point was showing up." A pause. "He showed up every day for the rest of his life." Cole rode beside her in the dark. "He sounds like a man worth the trouble of finishing what he started," Cole said. "He was," she said. "He is." They arrived in Billings the following morning, and Garrett met them at the edge of town with 2 more deputies and an expression of compressed urgency that suggested the 3 weeks they'd been given had been renegotiated by events. "Pemberton's lawyers filed for dismissal yesterday," Garrett said without preamble, "on the grounds that Thomas McBride's documents are personal property seized without proper warrant, and therefore inadmissible." He fell into step beside Cole's horse. Judge Alderman's replacement, a man named Forsyth, federal appointment, not Pemberton's, denied the dismissal, but they're going to challenge the chain of custody on every document. He looked at Eleanor. "They're going to argue the copies you made are fabrications." "Then I'll recite the originals from memory," Eleanor said. "Paragraph by paragraph if necessary." Garrett looked at her with the same expression he'd had at the ranch. The man holding dynamite, calculating the fuse. "The hearing is the day after tomorrow." "Good," she said. "I've been ready for 8 months." The federal courthouse in Billings was a building that took itself seriously. Stone, columns, the architecture of a system that wanted to announce its own permanence before you walked through the door. Cole had been in courthouses before, as a detective and as a witness, and had never found them particularly intimidating. What he found intimidating was the quality of attention in the room when Eleanor McBride walked in on the first day of the hearing. The lawyers in their suits, and the judge at his bench, and the gallery full of people who had heard pieces of this story through the territory's whisper system and had come to see the shape of the whole thing. She walked in, straight-backed and deliberate, in a dark dress she'd bought with the last of the money in Thomas's emergency envelope, with her pencil callus and her ink-stained knuckle, and 8.5 months of child. And she sat in the witness chair like a woman who had chosen her seat and intended to stay in it. Pemberton's lawyer was a man named Voss. He was from Chicago, expensive, and had the particular confidence of someone who had made witnesses doubt themselves in courtrooms for 20 years. He let Eleanor speak for an hour, give her account of Thomas's documentation process, the notebook, the copies, and then he stood up and looked at her with the practiced patience of a man who believes the opponent across from him is manageable. "Mrs. McBride," Voss said, "you claim to have read the original ledger documents belonging to Pemberton Mining Company, but you have no formal legal training. How can this court rely on your interpretation of accounting documents you are not qualified to assess?" "I taught mathematics and composition for 9 years," Eleanor said. "I can read a column of numbers, and I can read a contract. The documents I read required neither legal training nor advanced mathematics. They required literacy and attention." She held his eyes. "I have both." "Your copies were made from memory, you've told this court." "From the notebook, which I had in hand, and from memory where the notebook pages were damaged." She reached into her folder and produced a page. "I can demonstrate. Give me any page from the original ledger, and I will recite its contents before you open it." A murmur went through the gallery. Voss looked at the page she was holding, and then at his own table, and then at the judge. "That won't be necessary," Voss said. "I think it might be," Judge Forsyth said mildly from the bench. He had the appearance of a man who had been waiting a long time to preside over exactly this case and was not going to be hurried through it by an expensive Chicago lawyer. Voss picked a page from the Pemberton ledger that had been entered as evidence. He read a line from it. Eleanor repeated it back, word for word, including the date notation in the upper right corner and the account reference number at the bottom. Voss picked another page. She repeated that one too, including 2 cross-reference notations that Voss himself had to look twice to find. The murmur in the gallery went up a register. "Mrs. McBride," Voss said, and his voice had changed. Not rattled, not yet, but recalibrated, the way a man recalibrates when the terrain turns out to be different than the map suggested. "Your husband was, by your own admission, deeply emotionally invested in the outcome of his investigation. Is it not possible that his documentation reflects his predetermined conclusion rather than objective fact?" "Thomas was an accountant," she said. "Accountants document what the numbers say. The numbers he documented came from Pemberton's own ledgers, copied accurately and cross-referenced with the original inspection reports and payment records." She paused. "If the documents reflect a predetermined conclusion, that conclusion was predetermined by Augustus Pemberton when he wrote the entries, not by my husband when he copied them." Voss tried 3 more approaches over the next 40 minutes. Eleanor met every one of them the same way. Not combatively, not emotionally, with the precise, unhurried accuracy of a woman who has been living inside this material for 8 months and knows it better than the lawyer who was paid to counter it. Cole testified on the second day. He sat in the same chair and looked at the same room and said clearly and in order what had happened at Coleville. The documentation, the testimony, the falsified report. The night his supervisor had handed it back and told him to sign it. He described the 7 names that had been in his original report and removed from the replacement. He named them one by one, and the courtroom went quiet, in the way that rooms go quiet when something that has been absent is finally restored to the place it should have been. Voss cross-examined him for an hour. Cole answered every question with the same quality of directness that Eleanor had used, because he'd learned it partly from her over the last 2 weeks, and partly had always had it, and had simply been applying it to horses instead of men. When Voss asked why he hadn't spoken publicly about the falsified report in the 2 years since leaving the Pinkerton agency, Cole said, "Because I was wrong not to, and I knew it. And knowing it didn't make me do it anyway, until a woman drove a knife into a wagon board in a blizzard and used it to stand up. And I decided if she could do that, I could do this." The gallery was completely silent. Voss sat down. On the 3rd day, Garrett took the stand and laid out 16 months of investigative work. The pattern of accidents, the payments, the Chicago connection, the systematic architecture of corruption that Thomas McBride's notebook had given the structure to understand, and Cole's original files had given the Colville Foundation to prove. He was on the stand for 4 hours. He didn't rush any of it. He had the testimony of a man who has been building towards something for a long time, and is finally in the room where it matters, and is going to make every word count. Pemberton sat at the defense table through all of it, in a good suit, with his lawyers on either side of him, and the expression of a man who is watching a building he thought he owned come down around him, and is still, even now, calculating whether there is a version of this where he walks out of it intact. Cole had seen that expression before, on the ridge, on Cray's face in the kinder version of this story, on every man who has built a thing on the assumption that the people it harmed were too broken or too frightened to describe it accurately. He was wrong. They always were. The verdict came on the 5th day. Guilty on 11 counts. Trafficking of fraudulent labor arrangements. Criminal negligence resulting in death at Colville. Systematic corruption of public officials. Conspiracy across territorial lines. Holt was convicted separately on 7 counts. Judge Alderman, who had been arrested 2 days into the hearing, took a plea and gave names. 3 of the names were men in the gallery who were escorted out by federal deputies before the afternoon session. Voss filed for appeal immediately. Garrett had told them he would. The appeal would take months, possibly more than a year, and during that time, Pemberton would be held without bail, because Forsyth had read Thomas's notebook and understood exactly what kind of man made carriage accidents happen to people who knew too much. When the verdict was read, Eleanor was sitting in the gallery between Cole and James, with Clara asleep against her side in the boneless, total way of small children who make themselves comfortable without apology. She sat very still when Forsyth's voice finished reading the counts. James's hand found his mother's and held it. She held it back. She didn't cry. She didn't make a sound. She sat with her eyes forward and her jaw set, and her husband's notebook in the bag at her feet, and the pencil callus on her finger, and let it be true for a full minute before she moved. Then she exhaled, long and slow and complete. The exhalation of a woman releasing something she has been carrying for 8 months across a hard distance, and Cole felt the bench shift slightly with the release of it. Outside on the courthouse steps, Garrett came to stand with them in the cold afternoon air. He shook Cole's hand. He looked at Eleanor with the same expression he'd had since the porch in Cimarron. The man with the dynamite. Except it had been lit now, and had done what it was built to do. And what was left on his face was something quieter. The expression of a man who has been angry for a long time about his dead brother in a Pennsylvania mine, and has just watched the version of justice that was available in this world do what justice does when people refuse to let it be buried. "Your testimony was the cornerstone," he said to Eleanor. "The whole structure. Without the notebook, without the copies, without you sitting in that chair and reciting those pages, Voss would have found a seam and pulled it." He paused. "Thomas built the case. You delivered it." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "The 7 men from Colville," she said. "Will their names be in the federal record?" "Every one of them." Garrett said it without hesitation. In the verdict, in the sentencing record, in the permanent federal file. They will be in every document this case produces from this day forward. She nodded once. Then it's finished. Garrett put his hat on and went back inside, because there was still work to do, and Garrett was constitutionally incapable of leaving work undone. James looked up at Cole. "What happens now?" he asked. Cole looked at the boy, at the woman standing beside him, at the small girl who had woken up at some point during the verdict and was now examining the courthouse columns with the evaluative expression of someone assessing structural integrity. "Now," Cole said, "we go home." They went back to Copper Falls in the first week of December, when the territory had settled into its deep winter, and the snow was the permanent kind, the kind that didn't plan to leave until March. The school building on the main road was still standing, as Cole had said. Solid, well-built, cold from disuse, but structurally sound, with a good stove and 4 large windows that caught the morning light from the east. Eleanor walked through it alone the first afternoon, while Cole watched the children at the ranch, and Deputy watched Cole, with the knowing expression of a dog who has understood the situation clearly for some time, and is simply waiting for the humans to catch up. She came back with snow on her boots and a list of supply requirements she'd written in her small, precise hand on a piece of brown paper she'd found in her coat pocket. The same coat, the same pocket, where the edge of Thomas's letter had been folded since St. Louis. She put the list on the table between them. Cole read it. "You'll need a second bookshelf," he said. "I know. Can you build one?" "I can build 2. She looked at him across the table. The fire was going. The children were in the back room, Clara already asleep again. James reading the surveying textbook for the 3rd time, with the focus of someone who has decided on a direction and is simply acquiring the necessary knowledge. Deputy was at the hearth in his permanent retirement position. "Cole," she said. He waited. "Thomas showed up every day," she said. "That's what I told you on the road." She held his eyes. "I need you to know that's what I need. Not a gesture, not a rescue. Just someone who shows up." A pause. "Every day." He held her gaze. "Eleanor," he said, "I walked a lame horse 4 miles in a blizzard and stood on a porch with a shotgun for 12 hours and testified in a federal court in front of a man who gets paid to make people look small." He paused. "I reckon I know how to show up." Something moved across her face. The thing he'd seen in pieces since the beginning. In fragments and fractions and half-seconds, when her precision slipped and the woman underneath it was briefly visible. Not the controlled expression, not the jaw set or the flat voice or the hands pressed to the table. The full thing, unheld, unmanaged, given without calculation. She reached across the table and took his hand. Not gentle, the same way she'd taken it on the courthouse steps in Billings. Hard, certain, the grip of a woman who has stopped keeping track of what she can afford to hold. He held on. Varity Callahan was born on the 21st of December, which was the longest night of the year in Montana, and which Clara declared was perfect, because that meant Varity had arrived with all the night to herself, which was how important people should arrive. She came into the world screaming and strong, with her mother's dark hair and her father's capacity for making herself understood. And Cole held her first, because Eleanor's hands were still shaking, and someone needed to be steady, and that was a thing Cole knew how to do. He looked down at the small red face and the small furious fists and thought about Thomas McBride writing a name on a piece of paper by lamplight, knowing he was running out of time, trying to put truth into the world in whatever form he had left. "Varity," Eleanor said from the bed. Her voice was exhausted and fierce and completely certain. "Her name is Varity." Cole brought the baby to her and placed her carefully in Eleanor's arms, and Eleanor held her daughter for the first time with the specific expression of a woman who has fought through 8 months of impossible to arrive at this moment. Not soft, not sentimental, but profoundly and completely present. The way a person is present when they have earned the moment with everything they had. James stood in the doorway with Clara asleep against his shoulder, carried there because she'd refused to miss the birth and then fallen asleep 20 minutes in. He looked at his mother and his sister with the dark, careful eyes that had been watching and protecting and calculating since he was 6 years old. And for the first time, Cole saw those eyes do something they hadn't done since the East Ridge Road. They rested. Just rested. The school opened in January with 11 students and 1 teacher who had references from 3 institutions and a habit of telling her students on the first day that any document they could read was a document they could understand, and any document they could understand was a document that could not be used against them without their knowing it. Word got around, the way word gets around in small territories, and by February, there were 19 students, and by March, the school board was writing the 3 neighboring districts to explain what was happening in Copper Falls that seemed to be producing children who asked better questions than other children. And Eleanor McBride, Eleanor Hargrove, as of a quiet Sunday in February, when Reverend Caldwell officiated, and Clara scattered pine boughs because there were no wildflowers in February, and pine boughs were, she maintained firmly, an acceptable substitution, wrote back to the school board and told them exactly what was happening. She was teaching them to read everything. Cole built the 2nd bookshelf in March. He built a 3rd in April, when Eleanor's supply of books outgrew the 2nd one faster than either of them had anticipated, which she said was not her fault, and which he said was entirely her fault, and which was one of those conversations that ended with a particular specific quality of laughter that only exists between 2 people who have been through the fire together and come out the other side, finding each other still there. Garrett wrote twice from Billings. Pemberton's appeal had been denied. Holt's conviction had been upheld. The federal record was permanent, the names were in it, and the northern shaft had been closed pending a full safety inspection that Garrett had personally overseen with 3 independent engineers whose signatures had not been purchased. Driscoll resigned his badge in February and took work at a feed store in the next county, which Garrett wrote was, in his opinion, the appropriate outcome for a man who had made a bad choice and then made a better one. The names of the 7 men from Colville appeared in the federal verdict record in the sentencing documentation, and in a separate filing Garrett had submitted at his own initiative that listed every individual harmed by Pemberton Mining Company's operational practices between 1873 and 1878. It was a long document. Thomas McBride's notebook had made sure of that. On a morning in late spring, when the snow had finally released its hold on the Montana Territory, and the fields were coming back green, and the ranch was loud with new horses, and Clara's running commentary on everything she observed, and James's questions about land measurement, and Varity's extremely firm opinions about the world delivered at full volume from wherever she happened to be. Eleanor sat on the porch steps with her coffee and Thomas's notebook open in her lap. Not the evidence pages, the back pages. His handwriting, looser than his accounting entries. The handwriting of a man writing for himself, rather than for a court. She read for a while in the morning quiet, and Cole came out and sat beside her on the steps, and she didn't close the notebook, and he didn't look away. "He wrote about you," she said. Cole looked at her. "In the last entry. November, before the accident." She turned to the last written page and held it where he could see it. Thomas McBride's hand, small and careful. The hand of a man who understood that what he wrote might be the last thing he wrote, and so wrote it with full attention. He wrote that if the worst happened, the one man he trusted to have the documentation and the motive and the courage to use it was a former Pinkerton agent named Cole Hargrove, who had walked out rather than sign a lie. She looked at the page. He wrote that he didn't know how to find you. He wrote that he hoped you found Eleanor instead. Cole was quiet for a long moment. He wrote it, Eleanor said softly, 3 weeks before the accident. The morning was warm and bright, the specific brightness of a Montana spring morning that makes a person understand why people came to this territory and stayed in it. The space of it, the sky of it, the specific quality of air that has never been compromised. Verity's voice came through the open window, demanding something with the non-negotiable insistence of a 5-month-old who has already grasped that the world should organize itself around her needs. And Clara's voice answered, explaining things to her sister in the patient tone of a 6-year-old who has appointed herself primary educator. And James's boots were on the porch boards, coming toward the door, and then stopping when he saw his mother and Cole on the steps, and making the quiet decision to give them a minute. Eleanor closed the notebook. She held it for a moment, both hands, the same way she'd held it through the blizzard, and through the hearing, and through all the days between. Then she set it on the step beside her, carefully, reverently, the way you set something down when you're not letting it go, but you're allowing yourself to be somewhere other than inside it. She looked out at the field where the horses were moving in the morning light, and the fence Cole had repaired in March was straight and solid, and the cottonwood at the property line was coming back to leaf. He found you, she said. Not to Cole, not to herself. Just set it, into the morning air, clear and certain, the way a truth sounds when it has finally been given the room it always deserved. Cole took her hand. Thomas McBride had shown up every day of his life, right up until the day they made sure he couldn't. And in the notebook he'd left behind, in the names he'd written down and refused to let disappear, in the woman he'd trusted to carry it, and the man he'd hoped would help her carry it home, he was showing up still. Some people, Eleanor McBride had told her students that January morning, leave the world with less truth in it than they found. Thomas had left it with more. That was the whole of it, the full measure, the thing that was true before the federal record, and would be true long after the courthouse documents faded. A man who had kept faith with the truth until the last possible moment, and a woman who had carried it the rest of the way. And between them, they had made sure that what happened in the dark was dragged into the light, and named, and recorded, and set permanently into the world where it could not be unfound. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.